The storm had no business being that angry. Marcus Cole stood at his kitchen window, both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and watched the sky try to tear itself apart. Lightning split the darkness in jagged purple-white veins. Thunder followed not a second later, close enough that he felt it in his back teeth. The rain came down in sheets so thick he could barely see the fence line 30 feet out, and the wind bent the old oak in his yard like it was made of wet newspaper. He should have been in bed. He had a shift at the lumberyard in 5 hours. His alarm would scream at 4:30, and he would drag himself out of whatever couch or chair he'd passed out in, splash water on his face, and drive the 12 miles into town with one eye open and the other squinting against the headache that never quite went away anymore. That was his life. That had been his life for 3 years, ever since Karen took the kids and moved to her mother's house in Reno and left him with a mortgage he could barely afford and a silence so deep it had its own echo. But he couldn't sleep, he never could during storms anymore, not since Emily. Emily had been 4, she'd loved storms. She would press her face against the same window he was standing at now, breath fogging the glass, and she would laugh every time the lightning flashed. She called them sky fireworks. Karen hated that phrase, said it wasn't accurate. Marcus didn't care. He started calling them sky fireworks too, just to see his daughter's face light up. Then came the tornado warning. Then came the siren. Then came the window that didn't hold. He set the mug down on the counter. The ceramic clicked against the granite with a small, sharp sound that got swallowed by the storm. He didn't want to think about Emily right now. He didn't want to think about Karen or the empty rooms or the fact that the guest bedroom still had dinosaur stickers on the walls because he couldn't bring himself to peel them off. He wanted the storm to pass. He wanted sleep. He wanted morning. He wanted a lot of things he wasn't going to get. The power flickered. Once, twice, then died completely. The house dropped into a darkness so absolute that Marcus could only see the storm through the window, each flash of lightning briefly illuminating the kitchen like a strobe, freezing shadows in place before letting them go. "Great," he muttered. He moved to the hallway closet by memory, felt around until his fingers closed around the flashlight he kept on the top shelf and clicked it on. The beam was weak. The batteries were dying. He made a mental note to replace them and knew, with a certainty that bordered on comfortable, that he would forget. He was walking back toward the living room when he heard it. The knock. Marcus stopped. The flashlight beam hung in the air, trembling slightly because his hand had started trembling, and he stared at the front door like it had personally offended him. It was the middle of the night. It was the middle of a storm that was actively trying to kill the concept of civilization. There was no one who should be knocking on his door. Another knock, 3 this time, rapid, urgent, small. Not small like a polite tap, small like the hand that made it was small. His mind immediately went to the worst places. A kid, some kid out in this. Some kid who got lost or ran away or whose parents were worse than the storm. He felt something move in his chest, not quite panic, not quite courage, but that messy, uncomfortable space in between where decent people go when someone needs help and helping is going to cost them something. He went to the door. His hand paused on the deadbolt. Through the thin wood, he could hear the wind screaming, the rain hammering, and underneath all of it, so faint he almost convinced himself he imagined it, crying. Not adult crying, not the raw, ragged sobbing of someone who had lost something. This was different. This was the high, wailing, breathless cry of an infant, a baby, out there in that. Marcus unlocked the door and opened it. The wind hit him like a wall. Rain immediately speared into his face, and he had to brace one hand against the doorframe to keep from being pushed back. He swept the flashlight across the porch, the yard, the driveway, and saw nothing. Just rain and darkness and the sideways blur of his garbage cans tumbling across the lawn. He almost closed the door. He almost told himself he'd imagined it. The storm was loud enough to create sounds that didn't exist, to play tricks on ears that were already straining. Then the lightning flashed. And he saw it. It was sitting on his welcome mat. His welcome mat. The cheap, brown coconut fiber one that Karen had bought at a yard sale 7 years ago and that he kept meaning to replace but never did. Sitting on it in the middle of the most violent storm Marcus had seen in a decade was a baby. Except it wasn't. He knew it wasn't the moment the light hit it, and the knowledge came not from his brain but from somewhere deeper and older, some part of the human animal that remembered things from before language, before tools, before fire. Some part that recognized predator and prey and other and wrong. It was the size of a human infant, maybe a little larger. Its body was wrapped in something that looked like cloth, dark, soaked, heavy, but the cloth had slipped and Marcus could see what was underneath. Scales, small, overlapping scales that caught the dying flashlight beam and threw back colors that didn't have names. They shifted with every tiny movement the creature made, not green, not blue, not purple, but some impossible combination of all three that seemed to breathe on its own. Its face was narrow, elongated. The eyes were too large, too bright, set wider than a human's, and they were the color of molten copper. They caught the flashlight and reflected it back like an animal's eyes on a highway at night. There was a snout short, blunt, with two slits for nostrils that flared with each shuddering breath. And behind the creature's head, pressed flat against its neck by the rain and the wind, were folded structures that could have been ears or could have been something else entirely. Wings. The word appeared in Marcus's mind with such clarity that it startled him. Wings. Small, crumpled, wrapped tight against the creature's body like wet leaves, but wings. He could see the bone structure beneath the membrane, thin, delicate, veined like a butterfly's wing but thick and leathery and unmistakably built for flight. The creature opened its mouth and cried again. The sound went through Marcus like a fishhook through soft tissue. It caught somewhere behind his sternum and pulled, and he felt his eyes burn with a suddenness that shocked him. It wasn't the sound itself, though the sound was devastating, a thin, reedy wail that was equal parts distress and bewilderment and where am I and why am I alone? It was what the sound did to him. It bypassed every rational circuit in his brain and went straight to the part of him that had held Emily in the delivery room, that had paced the hallway at 3 a.m. with a colicky newborn pressed against his chest, that had learned to interpret 7 different types of crying and respond to each one without conscious thought. That part of him, the father part, the part he thought had died in a hospital room in Reno when a doctor told him there was nothing more they could do, that part woke up. The creature was shivering violently. Its scales, whatever they were made of, whatever impossible material composed them, were slick with rain, and its tiny body trembled so hard that Marcus could see the ripples running through the membrane of its folded wings. Its cries had a rhythm to them, 3 short wails, a pause, a longer, more desperate sound, another pause, over and over, like it was saying something, like it was calling for someone who wasn't there. Marcus stood in the doorway of his house, in a storm that had knocked out the power for 3 counties, staring at a baby dragon that had knocked on his door, and he had the absurd, disorienting thought that this was the most real thing that had happened to him in 3 years. Everything else, the lumberyard, the mortgage, the empty rooms, the cold coffee, the dinosaur stickers, felt like a dream he was half waking from. This trembling, crying, impossible creature on his welcome mat was more solid, more present than anything he'd touched or seen or heard since the day his world ended. He didn't decide to pick it up. He didn't weigh the options. He didn't think about disease or danger or the fact that he had absolutely no framework for understanding what was sitting on his porch. His body moved before his brain gave permission, just like it had when Emily cried, just like it had every time one of his kids needed him, and the thinking part of him was too slow to keep up. He stepped out into the storm, knelt down on the porch, and scooped the creature up in both hands. It weighed almost nothing, lighter than Emily had at birth. Its body was warm, warmer than a human's, he realized, a deep, radiating heat that pulsed against his palms like a heartbeat. The scales were smooth under his fingers, not hard like he'd expected, but supple, almost soft, with a texture like warm leather that had been oiled and polished for years. The cloth wrapped around it was some fabric he'd never felt before, lighter than silk but stronger, woven in patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The creature stopped crying the moment his hands closed around it. Just stopped mid-wail. The silence was so sudden that for a disorienting second Marcus thought it had died. Then he felt the rise and fall of its chest against his palms, rapid but steady, and the tiny fingers, 1 hand, 5 fingers, each one ending in a claw no longer than a kitten's, closed around his thumb with a grip that was startlingly strong. It looked up at him. Those copper eyes, blazing in the dark, met his, and Marcus felt something happen that he could only describe later as recognition. Not that he recognized the creature. He didn't. He'd never seen anything like it in his life. But the creature recognized him, or at least it made a decision about him. Some threshold was crossed, some judgment was rendered, and whatever the verdict was, it was favorable, because the tension went out of the creature's body like someone had pulled a plug, and it pressed its snout against the heel of his hand and made a sound that was not a cry. It was a hum, low, rumbling, vibrating through the creature's tiny body and into Marcus's hands and up through his arms and into his chest, where it settled like a warm stone. The sound was so fundamentally comforted that Marcus had to close his eyes for a moment because the feeling was too big and too complicated and too close to things he couldn't afford to feel anymore. He stood up, the wind nearly took him off the porch. He turned, stepped back inside, and kicked the door shut behind him. The silence of the house, the storm-muted, power-out silence, closed around them like a cocoon. Marcus stood in the hallway with the dragon baby in his hands and the rain pounding on the roof and the flashlight beam jittering across the ceiling, and he breathed. Ins out, ins out. The creature was still humming, still holding his thumb, still watching him with those impossible copper eyes. Okay, Marcus said out loud, because the sound of his own voice was the only normal thing left in the room. Okay, let's figure this out. He carried it to the kitchen, set it on the counter, gently the way he'd held Emily, one hand always supporting the head, the other cradling the body. The creature's wings unfurled slightly as it settled, and Marcus got his first real look at them. They were beautiful, horrifyingly, heart-stoppingly beautiful. The membrane was translucent at the edges, thin enough that he could see the kitchen ceiling through it, and it was veined in patterns that looked like river deltas seen from space, branching and splitting and rejoining in ways that seemed almost fractal. The color shifted as the wings moved, deep indigo at the base, fatting to a pale, ghostly silver at the tips, with something that might have been bioluminescence flickering in the veins like distant lightning. The creature sneezed. A tiny burst of something that was definitely not fire, not hot enough, not bright enough came from its nostrils. It was more like a spark, a brief orange-gold flicker that smelled of cinnamon and ozone and something floral he couldn't name. The spark hit the empty coffee mug on the counter and singed the inside of the ceramic, leaving a small black mark that smoked faintly. Marcus stared at the mug. The creature blinked up at him innocently. "Yeah," he said, "you're definitely not from around here." He found towels, the good ones, the ones Karen had picked out, the ones he never used because using them felt like admitting she was really gone, and wrapped the baby in them. It cooperated, lifting each limb one at a time as he dried it, making small sounds that he was beginning to interpret. The hum meant contentment. The click, soft, rapid, made with the tongue against the roof of the mouth, meant curiosity. The low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the towel and into his hands meant he wasn't sure. It didn't feel aggressive. It felt more like a purr, like a cat's purr, but deeper, more resonant, more intentional. The cloth it had been wrapped in was still tangled around its midsection. Marcus carefully unwound it, and the fabric fell open on the counter. It was about 3 feet square, and in the weak flashlight beam he could see that it wasn't just fabric. There was something on it. Writing, symbols. They were stitched into the material in thread so fine it was nearly invisible, forming patterns that spiraled inward toward the center. Marcus traced one line with his finger, and the thread glowed, faintly, briefly, a soft blue-white that faded as soon as he lifted his hand. There was something else, too. Tucked into a fold of the cloth, pressed flat against the spiral pattern, was a small object. Metal or something like metal, cool to the touch. Circular, about the size of a quarter, with a symbol etched into its surface that Marcus couldn't make sense of, 3 lines that crossed and recrossed each other, forming a shape that seemed to move when he tilted it in the light. The creature reached for the object. Its tiny claws closed around it, and it held the disc to its chest with both hands. Hands, Marcus kept thinking of them as hands, even though they were scaled and clawed and not quite right, and made a sound that broke his heart. It was a keening, soft, mournful. The creature wasn't crying. The tears it had shed on the porch seemed to be gone, dried or absorbed or simply ended, but it was grieving. Marcus didn't know how he knew that with such certainty, but he did, the same way he'd known to pick it up, the same way he'd known it was safe, the same way he knew his own name. Some knowledge didn't come from the brain. Some knowledge came from the blood. "Someone sent you," he said quietly. "Someone wrapped you up and put you on my porch and knocked on my door and left." The creature looked at him. The keening stopped. "Who?" Marcus asked. "Who left you here?" The creature tilted its head. The motion was bird-like, precise, and oddly endearing. Then it did something that made Marcus's breath catch. It pressed the metal disc against his hand, opened its claws, and let the cool metal fall into his palm, and then it reached up and touched his face. 5 tiny claws, warm scales, a touch so gentle it barely registered as pressure. The creature ran its hand along his cheek, from the corner of his eye to the edge of his jaw, and the hum started again, low, deep, resonant, and Marcus realized with a slow, creeping horror that the creature was reading him, not his expression, not his body language, him, his grief, his loneliness. His 3 years of silence and cold coffee and dinosaur stickers and the sound of a little girl laughing at sky fireworks. The creature pulled its hand back, made a soft clicking sound, and then settled into the towels with a finality that said very clearly, "You'll do." Marcus sat on the kitchen floor at 3 in the morning, in the dark, in a storm, with a baby dragon wrapped in his dead wife's good towels, and he laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It wasn't a sad laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had been handed something so far outside the boundaries of his reality that the only rational response was to surrender to the absurdity of it. "You'll do," he repeated. "I'll do for what?" The creature was already falling asleep. Its eyes, those burning copper coins, were half closed, the lids drooping with a heaviness that spoke of exhaustion so profound it must have been carrying it for hours, maybe days. Its breathing slowed. The hum faded to a barely perceptible vibration. The tiny clawed hand still held the edge of the towel, and its tail, Marcus hadn't noticed the tail before, thin and tapered, about a foot long, with a small diamond-shaped fin at the tip, curled around its own body like it was trying to hold itself together. Marcus sat there for a long time. The storm raged, the house groaned, the flashlight dimmed and died, and he didn't move to find another one. In the darkness, he could see the faint bioluminescent glow of the creature's wings pulse, fade, like a heartbeat made visible, and he found it oddly comforting, like a nightlight, like the one Emily used to have, the turtle one that projected stars on the ceiling. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, it was light. Gray, thin, watery light, the light of a morning after a storm when the clouds haven't quite decided to leave. The power was still out. His back ached from sleeping on the kitchen floor, his neck was a symphony of complaints, and the creature was gone. Marcus bolted upright so fast that blood rushed from his head, and his vision went white for 3 seconds. When it cleared, he scrambled to his feet, knocking over the coffee mug, and looked around the kitchen with the wild, unfocused panic of a parent who has lost sight of a child in a crowded place. He found it in the living room. It had crawled or maybe flown, though its wings seemed too small and too weak for actual flight, from the kitchen counter to the floor to the hallway to the living room, and it was now sitting in front of the television. Not watching it, the TV was off obviously. It was sitting in front of the shelf beneath the TV, the one where Marcus kept the photo albums he couldn't look at but couldn't put away, and it had pulled one down. The cover was open. The creature was looking at a photograph. Marcus knew which photograph it was without being close enough to see it. It was the one from Emily's 3rd birthday. Karen had set the timer on the camera and they were all in the shot, Marcus on one side, Karen on the other, Emily between them on the couch, face smeared with chocolate cake, grinning so wide it looked like her face might split in half. Marcus was grinning too. He barely recognized the man in that photograph. So young, so unburdened, so completely unaware that everything he loved was a timer counting down. The creature looked up at him as he approached. Then it looked back at the photograph. Then it reached out with one small claw and touched Emily's face in the picture, and it made a sound that Marcus had never heard it make before. A single clear bell-like note. Not a cry, not a hum, not a click. A note. Musical and pure and achingly sad, like the last sound of a music box before it winds down. "I know," Marcus said. His voice was rough. His eyes were wet. He hadn't cried in 2 years, not since the anger phase, the drinking phase, the phase where he threw every photo in the house into a box and shoved it in the garage and told himself he was fine, he didn't need any of it. "I know." The creature closed the photo album with surprising care, using both hands to align the edges and then pushed it toward him. The message was unmistakable. "This is yours, keep it, don't hide from it." Marcus picked up the album, he held it against his chest, and for the first time in 3 years he let himself cry. The creature didn't interrupt. It didn't hum or click or make any of the sounds he was beginning to associate with comfort. It simply sat on the floor watching him with those copper eyes and let him fall apart. When the sobbing finally ebbed, when the storm inside him that had been raging longer and harder than the one outside finally exhausted itself, the creature crawled into his lap, curled up against his stomach, and went to sleep. The heat of its body soaked through his shirt like a heating pad. The weight of it was almost nothing. But the presence of it, alive, warm, dependent, here was enormous. Marcus sat in his living room, holding a sleeping dragon, and felt something he'd been sure he would never feel again. Purpose. The first week was a disaster. Not because the creature was difficult, it wasn't, at least not in the ways Marcus expected. It didn't breathe fire. It didn't destroy the house. It didn't grow at an alarming rate or eat him out of house and home or do any of the things that the tiny, rational part of Marcus's brain kept insisting a dragon should do. The disaster was logistical. Marcus knew nothing about dragons. Nobody knew nothing about dragons because dragons weren't real, except there was one sleeping in a nest of towels on his couch, and it was very clearly real. And the entire framework of human knowledge that Marcus had spent 37 years building had exactly 0 entries for what to feed a baby dragon, or how often do baby dragons sleep, or is it normal for a baby dragon's scales to change color when it's dreaming. He started with what he knew. Human bobbies needed warmth, food, and sleep. Warmth was handled. The creature's internal temperature ran hot, somewhere around 110 degrees if the kitchen thermometer he'd pressed against its side was accurate, and it seemed comfortable at room temperature. In fact, it seemed to prefer cooler environments. It would seek out the coldest spot in whatever room it was in and curl up there, which led to a confusing moment on day 2 when Marcus couldn't find it anywhere and finally discovered it sleeping in the bathtub, pressed against the porcelain like it was the most comfortable bed in the world. Food was harder. He tried milk first, poured some into a shallow dish. The creature didn't seem to understand the concept of a bottle and set it on the floor. The creature sniffed it, sneezed another cinnamon spark, and looked at Marcus with an expression that he was beginning to recognize as disappointment. It was a very human expression. That was the unsettling part. The creature's face was not human, the snout, the eyes, the scale patterns, but its expressions were. Marcus had seen that same look on Emily's face when he'd tried to feed her peas. The same look on his son Jacob's face when he'd suggested that maybe, just maybe, the broccoli was worth a try. Fried eggs? Raw then scrambled then hard-boiled. The creature ate the scrambled eggs with enthusiasm that bordered on violence, practically diving face-first into the bowl and making sounds that were half hum, half growl, and entirely satisfied. Marcus watched it eat and realized two things. First, that the creature had teeth, small, sharp, visibly pointed teeth that were not at all suited for the soft foods he'd been offering, and second, that it was hungry. Not just hungry in the way a baby is hungry. Hungry in the way something is hungry when it hasn't eaten in a long time, when it's been rationing, when it's been waiting. He made more eggs. The creature ate 6 of them, 6 entire eggs scrambled in a bowl that was bigger than its whole body, and then sat back, licked its snout with a tongue that was surprisingly long and blue-black, and hummed contentedly. Over the next few days, Marcus expanded the menu. Chicken cooked, no bones was a hit. Fish even more so. The creature ate fish with a single-minded intensity that bordered on religious ecstasy, picking the meat clean from the bones with a dexterity that its tiny claws shouldn't have been capable of. Rice was tolerated. Vegetables were rejected with the same disappointed expression every single time without exception. Fruit was complicated. It loved berries, strawberries, blueberries, blackberries. But the first time it ate a strawberry, its scales flushed a deep, vivid red for about 30 seconds. And Marcus spent those 30 seconds in a state of near panic before the color faded and the creature looked up at him and clicked twice, which he was beginning to understand meant "I'm fine, you're overreacting." Sleep was the easiest part. The creature slept constantly, 16-18 hours a day, sometimes more. It slept in the bathtub mostly, but also on the couch on the floor near the front door. Once inside the refrigerator, when Marcus left the door open too long, he'd opened it to get milk, turned around to grab a glass, turned back, and found a baby dragon curled up on the shelf next to the leftover casserole, looking at him like, "This is perfectly normal and I don't know why you're starring." It slept curled in a tight ball, tail wrapped around its body, wings folded close. And when it slept, the bioluminescent pulse in its wing veins slowed to a gentle, rhythmic throb that Marcus found himself timing his own breathing to. On day 3, he gave it a name. He didn't plan to. He was sitting on the bathroom floor because that was where the creature had decided to sleep that night, and Marcus had dragged a blanket and a pillow in there because he wasn't about to let a baby sleep alone in a room it had chosen specifically because it was cold and hard and wrong, and he was watching it breathe. The rise and fall, the pulse of light in its wings, the tiny, almost imperceptible movement of its claws like it was running in its dreams. "Ember," he said. The word came out of him before he could stop it, and the moment it did, he felt a pang of guilt so sharp it physically hurt. Emily, he was nomming this creature after Emily. Was that wrong? Was that grotesque? Was he trying to replace his daughter with a dragon? The creature stirred, its eyes opened, 2 copper coins in the dim bathroom light, and it looked at him. Then it made a sound he'd never heard before, not a hum, not a click, not a bell note, a chirp, soft, high, musical. A sound that a bird might make if a bird had been designed by someone who wanted the sound to be perfect. It chirped twice, then closed its eyes and went back to sleep. And Marcus realized that the guilt had faded. Not gone, nothing that sharp ever fully goes, but faded the way pain fades when something warm presses against it. Ember wasn't replacing Emily. Ember was something new, something that had arrived at his door in a storm on the worst night of the worst year of his life and had chosen him. Him, a tired, broken man in a too-empty house who had nothing left to give. Except apparently he did. Apparently he had enough left to warm a creature that shouldn't exist, to feed it eggs and fish and berries, to sit on a bathroom floor at 2 in the morning and watch it dream. He leaned his head back against the wall. The house was quiet. The storm was gone. And for the first time in 3 years, Marcus fell asleep without dreaming about the things he'd lost. On day 5, Ember grew. It was subtle at first. Marcus noticed it in small ways. The towels he'd been using as a bed seemed tighter, the food bowl seemed smaller, the bathtub seemed less roomy. Then he actually really looked, and realized that Ember was noticeably larger than it had been 5 days ago. Not dramatically, maybe 20% bigger overall, but definitely measurably larger. Its limbs were longer. Its snout was slightly more pronounced. Its wings, when it spread them, had a span of nearly 2 feet. And its scales had changed. The color-shifting quality was still there, but it was more pronounced now, more deliberate. When Ember was calm, its scales settled into a deep, iridescent blue-green that reminded Marcus of the ocean on a clear day. When it was excited, like when Marcus came home from the lumberyard on day 6 and Ember was waiting by the door, the scales brightened, shifting toward gold and copper. When it was upset, like when Marcus accidentally closed the bathroom door not realizing Ember was inside, the scales darkened to a near black that was somehow more unsettling than threatening. On day 7, Marcus came home to find that Ember had learned to fly. Not fly, not sustained, powered, across-the-room flight. But the creature had figured out that its wings could be used to extend a jump, and it had been practicing. Marcus walked in the front door to find Ember on top of the refrigerator, wings spread, looking down at him with an expression of pure, undiluted pride. "How did you get up there?" Marcus said. Ember chirped, then it jumped. The descent was not graceful. It was, in fact, spectacularly ungraceful, a chaotic flurry of wings and limbs and tail that ended with Ember hitting the kitchen floor, tumbling and sliding across the linoleum into the cabinet beneath the sink. There was a pause, a beat of silence, then a small, indignant growl from beneath the sink. Marcus laughed, not the broken laugh from the first night. A real laugh. The kind that starts in the belly and works its way up and comes out in a sound that you don't recognize because it's been so long since you made it. Ember emerged from under the sink, shook itself off, scales rippling in an annoyed pattern of black to dark gray, and looked at him. Then it chirped again, climbed the kitchen drawers like a ladder, and jumped from the counter. This time, the wings caught the air. Just for a second. Just long enough to turn a fall into a glide, and Ember landed on the floor with a delicate precision that was immediately ruined by the fact that it tripped over its own tail. Marcus was still laughing. He picked Ember up. The creature was heavier now, maybe 5 pounds, a solid warmth in his hands, and held it at eye level. Ember looked at him. Marcus looked at Ember. Those copper eyes met his, and something passed between them that Marcus could not have articulated if he'd had 1,000 years and a dictionary the size of a cathedral. "I'm glad you knocked on my door," he said. Ember pressed its snout against his forehead. The hum started, deep, resonant, vibrating through both of them, and Marcus felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the creature's internal temperature. On day 10, the cloth spoke. Marcus had left the fabric, the strange, shifting cloth that Ember had been wrapped in on the kitchen counter, mostly because he didn't know what else to do with it. He'd examined it several times, running his fingers over the stitch symbols, watching the thread glow faintly at his touch, but nothing had happened. It was just cloth. Weird cloth, but cloth. On day 10, Ember found it. Marcus was in the shower when he heard the sound, a chime clear and musical like a crystal glass struck with a silver spoon. He turned off the water, wrapped a towel around himself, and went to the kitchen. Ember was sitting on the counter next to the cloth, and the symbols stitched into the fabric were glowing. Not the faint, barely visible glow from before. This was bright, vivid. The blue-white light filled the kitchen, and the symbols were moving, not physically but visually, the way a hologram moves, shifting and rearranging themselves into new patterns. Marcus watched, water dripping from his hair onto the floor as the symbols formed shapes. Not letters he could read, not words in any language he knew, but images. A dragon, adult. Massive, wings spread wide enough to blot out a sky. The image was made of light, floating 6 inches above the cloth, and it was so detailed that Marcus could see individual scales, the texture of the wing membrane, the gleam of eyes that were the same copper as Ember's. The image shifted. The adult dragon was flying now, soaring over a landscape that Marcus couldn't identify, mountains and forests and rivers rendered in the same blue-white light. Then the image changed again, and Marcus felt his breath stop. The adult dragon was falling. Not flying, falling, wings torn, trailing smoke and something darker, blood maybe, or something that served the same purpose. The landscape below was war. He could see it now, flashes of light, explosions, shapes moving and colliding. The dragon hit the ground and the image pulsed, and when it steadied again, the dragon was lying in a crater, broken and still. Then the image shifted one more time, and Marcus saw Ember. Not as it was now, small, fragile, wrapped in cloth, but as it would be. He didn't know how he knew that the image was the same size, the same shape, but he knew with the same inexplicable certainty that had guided him from the moment he opened the door that he was looking at Ember's future. A dragon in flight alone over a different landscape, one that looked disturbingly like Earth. Cities and highways and farmland rendered in blue-white light. And on the ground, tiny and insignificant and looking up, was a figure. Human. Standing in a field, face tilted toward the sky, one hand raised in a gesture that could have been waving or reaching or both. The image faded, the symbols dimmed, the cloth was just cloth again. Ember was sitting very still. Its scales had gone the dark, near-black color that Marcus associated with distress, and its copper eyes were fixed on the cloth with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Then, slowly, Ember turned its head and looked at him. The look lasted a long time. 5 seconds. 10, 30, Marcus didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. He felt like he was being weighed again, measured and assessed, and found either sufficient or wanting, and the verdict hadn't come in yet. Then Ember made the bell sound, the single, clear, mournful note from the first morning, but this time it didn't stop. The note stretched, lengthened, deepened, and other notes joined it, harmonics, overtones, a chord that built and built until the air in the kitchen was thick with it, until the windows rattled and the dishes hummed and Marcus felt the sound in his bones and his teeth and the spaces between his ribs. It was a song, a lament, something ancient and grief-soaked and utterly, heartbreakingly beautiful, and it was being sung by a creature the size of a house cat that had been in his life for 10 days. When it ended, the silence was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Ember looked at him. The The dark scales began to lighten, black to gray, gray to blue-green to something warmer. And then it crawled across the counter, pressed itself against his chest, and hummed. Marcus put his arms around it, held it close. Felt the heat of it, the pulse of it, the impossible, terrifying reality of a creature from a world he couldn't imagine, a creature that had lost everything. The image of the falling dragon was burned into his mind, and he understood with that blood-deep certainty that Ember was alone in a way that went beyond orphanhood, beyond abandonment. Ember was the last, or close to it. Whatever had happened to the adult dragon in the vision, whatever war, whatever catastrophe had torn those wings and ended that life, Ember was the result. A child sent away. A life preserved at the cost of everything else. Wrapped in cloth by hands that knew they would never hold the child again, and left on a doorstep in a storm in a world that didn't even know dragons existed. Left on his doorstep. "Why me?" Marcus whispered. Ember didn't answer, it just hummed. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most meaningful of Marcus's life. Ember grew faster than any earthly creature. By the end of the first month, it was the size of a golden retriever, sleek and long-limbed, with a tail that had grown proportionally longer and more powerful and a wingspan that exceeded 4 feet. Its scales had settled into a base color of deep sapphire blue, with the color-shifting quality still present but more subtle, like the way a real sapphire catches light differently at different angles. Its eyes were brighter now, not just copper but gold, with flecks of deeper amber that seemed to swirl when it was thinking hard about something. It could fly, really fly, not the clumsy, tumbling, tail-tripping attempts from the refrigerator incident, but actual, controlled, sustained flight. Marcus came home one afternoon to find Ember circling the living room, wings spread, making lazy figure eights around the ceiling fan with a precision that would have made a hawk jealous. It landed on the back of the couch, folded its wings, and chirped at him with an expression that very clearly said, "Did you see that? Did you see what I just did?" "I saw," Marcus said. Ember preened, ran its claws along its wing membranes, smoothing out the veins, adjusting the edges with a fastidiousness that was almost comical. Marcus watched and realized with a start that Ember was vain. It cared about how it looked. It had an aesthetic sense. It was, in its own alien way, fashionable. He started leaving the windows open. This was probably a mistake. The neighbors, what few there were on his rural road, hadn't noticed anything yet, but a dragon, even a small one, flying in and out of windows was going to attract attention eventually. Marcus knew this. He also knew that keeping Ember cooped up in the house was cruel in a way he couldn't stomach. The creature needed to fly the way a bird needed to sing. It wasn't optional, it was fundamental. So he compromised. Ember could fly at dawn and dusk when the light was low and the neighbors were either asleep or inside. During the day, it stayed in the house, or more accurately in the backyard, where Marcus had rigged a tarp over the porch and created a sort of outdoor enclosure that Ember tolerated with the same disappointed expression it reserved for vegetables. They developed a routine. Marcus would get up at 4:30, do his shift at the lumberyard, come home at 2, and spend the rest of the day with Ember. He'd feed it 6 eggs and a pound of fish every morning, plus whatever berries he could afford, and then they'd have what Marcus thought of with some embarrassment as enrichment time. He'd throw things for Ember to catch mid-flight. He'd set up obstacle courses in the backyard out of lawn chairs and PVC pipe. He'd sit on the porch and read aloud children's books, mostly the ones he'd saved from Emily's room, because something about the simple language and the bright illustrations seemed to hold Ember's attention in a way that adult fiction didn't. And Ember listened, not passively, not the way a dog listens to its owner's voice with vague, pleasant comprehension, but actively. Its head would tilt. Its ears, the structures behind its head that Marcus had decided were in fact ears, would swivel and adjust. Its eyes would track the pages as Marcus turned them, and sometimes when he said a word it particularly liked, it would chirp or click or make a sound that he was beginning to suspect was an attempt at repetition. On day 37, Ember said its first word. Marcus was reading Where the Wild Things Are, Emily's favorite, the one with the pages so worn the binding was duct-taped together, and he'd just gotten to the part where Max says, "Let the wild rumpus start," when Ember looked up from where it was curled in his lap and opened its mouth. Rumpus. The word was imperfect. The R was more of a trill, the P was softened by the shape of Ember's mouth, and the us at the end came out as a hiss that raised the hairs on Marcus's arms. But it was a word. A real, actual English word spoken by a creature that had been on this planet for 5 weeks. Marcus stared at Ember. Ember stared back. Then it said it again, rumpus, with more confidence this time, and its scales flushed gold with what Marcus had come to understand was pride. Jesus, Marcus said. Ember tilted its head. Jesus, it repeated, then rumpus. Marcus closed the book. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from something else, something bigger and stranger and more terrifying than fear. He was witnessing something that should have been impossible. A dragon, a creature from another world, another reality, was learning to speak, not just mimic, Learned the difference was in the eyes. When Ember repeated a word, its eyes weren't blank or glassy, they were focused, intent, processing. It was understanding, maybe not fully. Maybe not at the level a human child would, but it was understanding enough, and it was getting better every day. Over the following weeks, Ember's vocabulary grew at an astonishing rate, not just individual words but concepts. It learned up and down and hot and cold and hungry and tired and play and stop and no, which it learned quickly but obeyed rarely. It learned outside and inside and fly and ground. It learned Marcus's name, Marcus, and said it with a particular inflection, a slight lift at the end that made it sound like a question, like it was checking every time to make sure he was still there, still Marcus, still the one who had opened the door. It did not learn goodbyes. Marcus tried to teach it once, just once. He was standing at the front door, keys in hand, heading to the lumberyard, and he said, "Goodbye, Ember, I'll be back." Ember looked at him. Its scales went dark, not black, but close, a deep, turbulent gray-blue that Marcus had only seen a few times before, always in connection with loss. The cloth, the photo, the song. No, Ember said, it was the clearest word it had ever spoken. Marcus didn't try to teach it goodbye again. By month 3, Ember was the size of a horse. This was becoming unmanageable. Not because Ember was dangerous, it wasn't, at least not to Marcus. The creature was gentle with a deliberateness that went beyond training or habit. When it walked through the house, it stepped carefully around furniture, its massive claws, now 6 inches long and sharp enough to cut through sheet metal, placed with a precision that suggested it was actively calculating each step to avoid damage. When it touched Marcus, it was always with the restrained gentleness of something that knew exactly how strong it was and chose to be soft. But the house wasn't built for a horse-sized dragon. The backyard enclosure was a joke, and the neighbors had started asking questions. Tom Ridley from 3 doors down had seen Ember flying at dusk. He described it to Marcus over the fence, a big bird, maybe a crane or something, weird coloring, and Marcus had nodded and agreed and changed the subject. But Tom wasn't the only one. Peggy Allender had seen something in Marcus's yard. The Henderson kids had sworn they saw a dinosaur through the trees. And someone, Marcus didn't know who, had called animal control, presumably to report an unidentified large animal in the area. He needed a plan. He needed land, space, somewhere Ember could fly and grow and exist without being seen. He needed money he didn't have and resources he couldn't access, and a version of his life that didn't involve a baby dragon that was rapidly becoming not a baby at all. He was sitting at the kitchen table going over his finances for the dozenth time when Ember walked in from the backyard. It had to duck to get through the door, a full-grown horse but longer, leaner, with a tail that was now nearly 6 feet and wings that, when folded, brushed the ceiling. Its scales were a deeper blue now, almost cobalt, with veins of gold running through them that caught the light like mineral deposits in stone. Its head was level with Marcus's when it stood on all fours, and its eyes, those gold and amber swirls, were intelligent in a way that was no longer surprising but was still, sometimes, breathtaking. Ember sat down beside him. Just sat like a dog, except no dog had ever weighed 400 pounds or had wings folded along its flanks or had exhaled a breath that smelled of cinnamon and made the kitchen warm enough that Marcus could take off his jacket. Problem, Ember said. Its vocabulary had expanded to several hundred words now, and while it still struggled with complex sentences, its comprehension was remarkable. It understood far more than it could say. Yeah, Marcus said, big problem, you're getting too big for the house. Ember looked around the kitchen, then it looked back at Marcus and said very clearly, go. Go where? Ember didn't answer with words. It reached out with one massive claw carefully, so carefully, and touched the cloth that Marcus had kept on the kitchen table this whole time, 3 months, never put away, never moved. The symbols on the cloth flared briefly, and Marcus saw again in his mind's eye the image from the first time, the dragon flying over Earth, over cities and farmland, and the human figure on the ground looking up. Not yet, Marcus said, you're not ready. Ember tilted its head, ready. The vision, the cloth, you flying over, he gestured vaguely. Out there, where people can see you, where he stopped. Where people would be afraid, where people would shoot first and ask questions never, where the military would get involved and scientists and the government and everything would become a nightmare of containment and study, and they'll put you in a cage, Ember. They'll put you in a cage and poke you with things and never let you out. He didn't say any of that, he didn't have to. Ember was reading him again, had been reading him, he realized, this whole time, every time they were close, every time those gold eyes met his. The creature understood his fears before he articulated them. It understood them better than he did maybe because it could feel them directly without the filter of language, without the lies people tell themselves to make fear manageable. Safe, Ember said, the word was almost a question. You're safe here, Marcus said, but you can't stay here, you need, he ran his hands through his hair. You need space. You need to fly without worrying about being seen. You need to grow. Ember was quiet for a long moment. Then it said a word Marcus had never heard it used before. Home. The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Home, not this house. This house was shelter, was a roof and walls and a kitchen table, but it wasn't home, not anymore, not since Karen and the kids left. Home was something else. Home was where you belonged. Home was where someone was glad you existed. Is this your home? Marcus asked. Ember looked at him, and in those gold and amber eyes Marcus saw something he'd seen once before, on the welcome mat, in the storm, in the dark, when a creature the size of a newborn had looked up at him and made a decision. You'll do. Yes, Ember said. Marcus put his forehead against Ember's snout. The scales were warm and smooth and alive, and the creature's breath washed over him in a wave of cinnamon heat, and he felt the hum start deep, resonant, the sound that had become the center of his gravity, the note that his life tuned itself to. Then we'll figure it out, he said, together. He bought land. It took everything he had, every penny of savings, the retirement account he'd been ignoring, the small life insurance payout from Emily's policy that he'd never been able to look at without feeling like the money was cursed. 200 acres of woodland and pasture 20 miles outside of town, bordered by state forest on 3 sides and a river on the 4th. No close neighbors, no roads, no foot traffic, just trees and grass and sky. He moved Ember there on a Tuesday night in the bed of his truck with a tarp over the cargo and a knot in his stomach that wouldn't untie. Ember had to be coaxed into the truck bed. It didn't like enclosed spaces, had never liked them, and the truck bed with the tarp pulled over it was about as enclosed as you could get. But Marcus sat in the back with it, one hand on its neck, murmuring reassurances in the dark, and after 20 minutes of low, uneasy growling, Ember settled. The drive took 45 minutes. Ember pressed against Marcus the entire way, its massive body radiating heat that turned the truck bed into a sauna, its gold eyes visible beneath the edge of the tarp, watching him with that unwavering, unreadable gaze. When they arrived, Marcus pulled back the tarp, and Ember looked out at the land. 200 acres of dark. The moon was nearly full, and it turned the pasture into a silver sea, and the trees were black columns against a sky so dense with stars it looked like someone had shattered a mirror overhead. The river was a ribbon of reflected moonlight. The air was clean and cold and smelled of pine and earth and nothing else, no exhaust, no chemicals, no human noise. Ember stepped out of the truck. It stood in the pasture, head raised, wings slightly spread, and it breathed. One deep, slow breath that Marcus could actually see, because Ember's scales flared slightly with each inhale, catching the moonlight, and dimmed with each exhale like a living lantern. Then it spread its wings to their full span, 12 feet now, maybe more, and breathtakingly beautiful in the moonlight, the membrane translucent and silver-veined and alive with that faint, bioluminescent pulse, and it looked at Marcus. Fly, it said, not a question, not a request, a statement of intent. Fly, Marcus agreed. Ember ran, 3 strides, 4, each one shaking the ground, and then the wings caught the air and the ground was gone and Ember was up, rising, climbing, soaring into the moonlit sky with a grace that made Marcus's chest ache. It climbed until it was a silhouette against the stars, and then it banked, turned, and dove, not in a fall but in a controlled, exhilarating plunge that ended in a pull-up so close to the ground that the grass bent flat in a wave beneath it. And then it was up again, spiraling, climbing, looping through the night air with a joy that was so pure and so uncomplicated that Marcus found himself laughing and crying at the same time. He stood in his pasture at midnight and watched a dragon fly. Not a metaphor, not a dream, not a story or a legend or a special effect in a movie. A real dragon, his dragon silk and scale and fire and light, carving through the darkness like it had been born to do exactly this, in exactly this place at exactly this moment. Ember flew for an hour. Then it landed beside Marcus, folded its wings and pressed its snout against his chest. The hum started, that deep, familiar resonance, and Marcus put both arms around Ember's neck and held on. Home, Ember said again. Yeah, Marcus whispered, home. The cabin came next. Marcus built it himself with lumber from the yard. He got a generous employee discount, and his boss, a gruff man named Dell who had never asked questions about Marcus's sudden interest in 200 acres of wilderness, threw in the warped and damaged boards for free. It wasn't much. 1 room really, a main space with a wood stove, a sleeping loft, a small kitchen area, and a porch that faced the pasture. But it was solid. It was warm. And it had a door that opened outward, onto the land, onto the sky, onto the place where Ember flew every dawn and dusk without fear of being seen. They settled into a new routine. Marcus still worked his shift at the lumberyard, but now the drive was longer, 45 minutes each way, and he spent less time at the cabin and more time on the road. Ember didn't like the long absences. It would wait by the truck when Marcus left in the morning, and it would be waiting when he came back. And the dark scales would creep in during the hours between, not full black, never full black anymore, but a muted gray-blue that Marcus had learned to read as loneliness. He started talking to Ember more. Not just reading to it, actually talking. Telling it about his day, about the lumberyard, about Dell's bad jokes and the new guy who kept cutting boards too short and the woman in the office who brought cookies every Friday. Telling it about things he remembered, Emily's first steps, Jacob's first word, truck, appropriately enough. The time Karen had tried to make Thanksgiving dinner and set the turkey on fire, and they'd ended up eating peanut butter sandwiches, and it was the best Thanksgiving they'd ever had. Ember listened, it always listened. And sometimes when Marcus said something that resonated, something true, something that came from the honest place rather than the guarded one, Ember would hum. That deep, resonant, bone-settling hum that meant I hear you, I'm here, you're not alone. On the nights when the loneliness was too heavy, the nights when Marcus sat on the porch and stared at the stars and felt the silence pressing in like water filling a sinking ship, Ember would come and sit beside him, not asking anything, not demanding attention, just being there. 400 pounds of dragon, warm as a furnace, scales glowing faintly in the dark, a living, breathing argument against the idea that Marcus Cole was alone in the universe. 6 months in, Ember spoke its first full sentence. They were on the porch, it was October. The leaves were turning and the pasture was a patchwork of gold and red and green, and the air had that crisp, clean edge that makes everything feel sharper and more real. Ember was lying at Marcus's feet, tail curled around the porch support, wings half spread to catch the last of the afternoon sun. Its scales were doing the thing where they shifted color in response to the light, sapphire in the shadows, gold in the sun, a deep shimmering teal in between. Marcus was thinking about Emily. He did that less now, less often, less painfully, but October was her birthday month and the grief had a way of circling back, of finding the cracks in the armor he'd built and seeping through. 3, he said, not realizing he'd spoken aloud until the word was out. She would have been 7 this month. Ember lifted its head, looked at him. Those gold eyes, ancient and young at the same time, held his gaze for a long moment. Then Ember said, slowly and with an effort that was audible in every syllable. She was your child. It wasn't a question, Marcus's breath caught. In 6 months, Ember had never asked about Emily, had never pressed, never pried, never pushed at the wound. It had simply been present while Marcus grieved, a steady, warm constant in the background of his pain. But it had been watching, listening, putting the pieces together. Yes, Marcus said, his voice was rough. She was my child. Ember was quiet, then you loved her. Oh yes, you still love her. Always. Another silence, longer this time. Ember's scales shifted through several colors, blue to gray to a soft, warm amber that Marcus had never seen before. Then Ember lowered its massive head and rested it on Marcus's knee and said, I know what it is, to lose my, it stopped. The word wouldn't come. Marcus could feel the creature struggling, not with language but with the emotion behind the language, with the weight of a loss so enormous that the human word for it was nowhere near adequate. Your family, Marcus said quietly. Ember's eyes closed. A single sound escaped, not a word, not a hum, but something in between, an acknowledgement, a confirmation. A grief too vast for language expressed in a single shuddering breath. Marcus put his hand on Ember's head. The scales were warm and smooth, and beneath them he could feel the pulse of something immense. The heartbeat of a creature that was, even now, still growing, still becoming, still carrying the weight of an entire species on its narrow, scaled shoulders. I can't replace them, Marcus said. I know that, I would never try. Ember opened its eyes, not replace, add. Marcus stared. Of all the things Ember could have said, of all the hundreds of words it had learned, all the concepts it had grasped, that was the one it chose. Not replace, add. You're not my child, Marcus said. The words felt wrong even as he said them, because they were true and they weren't true, because the relationship he had with Ember didn't fit into any category that human language had built. Ember clicked, a soft, rapid sound that meant understanding, nuance. I know what you mean and I mean something slightly different. No, not child, not pet, not friend. It paused and Marcus could almost hear the gears turning, the vast alien mind reaching for a concept that existed in its language but not his. Bonded. Bonded, Marcus repeated. When I found you, you were broken like eggshell, cracked, inside, still alive, still warm. I needed warmth, you needed purpose. Each word came slowly, carefully assembled with the deliberate precision of someone building something out of fragile materials. We are bonded not by blood, by choice, by storm, by door you opened. Marcus's vision blurred. He blinked, and tears ran down his cheeks, and he didn't wipe them away because there was no one to hide from and no reason to hide, and Ember had already seen every broken piece of him anyway. Bonded, Marcus said again. Yeah, I think that's right. Ember hummed. The sound filled the porch, filled the evening air, filled the space between them with something that was more than sound, something that was connection. rendered in frequencies that human ears weren't designed to hear, but human hearts were designed to feel. The sun set, the stars came out, and Marcus sat on the porch of a cabin he'd built with his own hands, on land he'd bought with everything he had, with a dragon's head on his knee and a grief he'd finally learned to carry without being crushed by it. And he felt, for the first time in 3 years, like the storm was over. The visitor came on a night exactly 1 year after the storm. Marcus knew something was wrong before he saw anything. Ember knew too. The dragon was on its feet the moment the sun went down, scales flickering through colors in rapid, agitated succession, wings half spread, head high, nostrils flared. It was staring at the sky. Ember was. Ember made a sound Marcus had never heard before. A low, continuous tone, not a hum, not a growl, but something between them. A warning, a greeting, a question. Then the sky opened. Not like a storm, not like clouds parting. The sky literally opened, a seam in the darkness, thin as a hairline fracture spreading outward from a central point directly above the pasture. Through the seam, light poured, not white light, not golden light, but light in colors that Marcus's eyes couldn't process. Colors that existed in a spectrum beyond the human range, translated by his brain into a shimmering, kaleidoscopic wash that made his head ache and his eyes water. Something came through the seam. It was vast, too vast for Marcus to comprehend. His mind kept trying to fit it into familiar categories and failing, the way a computer fails when you give it a file type it can't read. Wings, yes, wings, but wings that span the width of the pasture and then some membranous and translucent, and alive with the same bioluminescent pulse as embers, but on a scale so massive that the pulse was like a heartbeat you could feel in the ground. A body, long serpentine, covered in scales that were the same impossible blue-green gold as embers but darker, richer, more complex, like the difference between a child's drawing and a masterpiece. A head narrow, crowned with structures that might have been horns or might have been sensory organs or might have been something for which there was no earthly equivalent, and eyes. Eyes that were copper. The same copper as embers. The same copper that Marcus had seen on his welcome mat in a storm 1 year ago, in the face of a creature the size of a newborn that had knocked on his door and changed his life. The adult dragon descended into the pasture with a slowness that Marcus recognized as caution, not gravity. It was being careful. Careful of the ground, careful of the trees, careful of the cabin, careful of him. It landed gently, impossibly gently for something so large, and folded its wings, and the seam in the sky closed behind it, and suddenly the night was just a night again, dark and quiet and ordinary except for the dragon. Ember moved. It walked forward, not running, not flying, but walking with a steady, deliberate grace that Marcus had never seen in it before. It walked to the adult dragon and stopped 10 feet away, and the two of them looked at each other. No sound, no hum. No chirp or click or bell note. Just silence and eye contact and something passing between them that Marcus could feel but not understand, like standing outside a room where people are speaking a language you don't know, but somehow still conveying urgency and love and loss. Then the adult dragon lowered its head, lowered it all the way to the ground, until it was level with Ember, until those massive copper eyes were inches from Ember's smaller gold ones, and it made a sound. One sound, one note. The same bell note that Ember had made on the first morning looking at Emily's photograph, but deeper, richer, older. A note that contained within it the entirety of a species' grief, the fallen dragons, the lost war, the children sent through seams in reality to doors in storms, and also something else. Something that sounded impossibly like hope. Ember responded with its own note. Higher, younger, but the same melody, the same song. And the two notes wove together, harmonized, created a chord that was so beautiful and so sad that Marcus sank to his knees on the porch and pressed his hands over his ears because he couldn't bear it and couldn't stop listening, and the paradox of that was tearing him apart. The song lasted a long time. Minutes, hours, Marcus didn't know. Time had stopped working. When it finally ended, the silence that followed was the loudest thing Marcus had ever heard. The adult dragon raised its head. It looked at Marcus. Not at Ember, at Marcus. And in those copper eyes, Marcus saw recognition not of him personally, but of what he was. A human. A member of a species that the dragon's people had studied, perhaps, or observed, or simply known about from a distance. A species that was small and fragile and short-lived, and against every reasonable expectation capable. Capable of opening a door in a storm. Capable of picking up a creature that shouldn't exist and holding it like a child. Capable of building a cabin with warped lumber and buying land with cursed money and sitting on a porch night after night, talking to a dragon about cookies and first steps and peanut butter sandwiches. Not because it made sense, but because love doesn't need to make sense. The adult dragon spoke, not in words, in something else. A vibration that bypassed Marcus's ears entirely and arrived directly in his mind, fully formed, like a thought that wasn't his. You kept our child alive. Marcus's mouth opened, but no sound came out. We did not choose you randomly. We chose you because you were broken, and broken things know how to hold other broken things without expecting them to be whole. We chose you because we watched you lose and we saw what you did with the loss. You held it. You did not discard it. You did not pretend it was not there. You carried it, and because you carried it, you had room to carry our child too. The dragon's eyes were luminous in the dark. Not glowing, luminous the way the sky is luminous just before dawn, filled with light that has no visible source. There are other children sent to other doors in other storms in other places. Some were found by people who were afraid, some were found by people who were cruel, some were not found at all. A pause and the luminosity dimmed, and Marcus felt the weight of that pause like a physical thing, but some were found by people like you. People who opened the door, people who chose to hold on. Ember will grow, Ember will become what it was meant to be. And when the time comes, when the seam opens again and the war comes to this sky, Ember will not face it alone. Because you taught it something that no other species in all the worlds we have touched has ever been able to teach our young. Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. What? The adult dragon's answer was not a vibration or a thought. It was an image placed directly in Marcus's mind with a precision that was almost surgical. He saw himself seen from above, seen through copper eyes, standing on his porch watching Ember fly. He saw the way he looked when he watched Ember. He saw his own face, and he was startled by what he saw there because it was not the face he saw in the mirror every morning. It was the face of a man who was not broken anymore. You taught it, the dragon said, that love is not a weakness, that grief and love can coexist, that loss does not end the capacity to care. We are warriors, we are ancient and powerful, and we have shaped skies and moved mountains, and our fire has lit the darkness between worlds. But we did not know how to do what you have done. We did not know how to love something small and fragile and temporary and do it anyway, knowing the loss that would come. You taught our child the most dangerous thing in any universe. What? Marcus asked again. Hope, the kind that survives loss. The adult dragon turned its massive head back to Ember. The two of them regarded each other for a long moment, and then the adult dragon breathed out. A long, slow exhalation that was not fire but something else. A mist of golden light that wrapped around Ember like a blanket, sinking into its scales, absorbing into its wings, settling into its bones. Ember shivered and its scales blazed gold, brighter than Marcus had ever seen, so bright that the pasture was lit like noon. And then the gold faded and Ember was different. Marcus couldn't say how. The size was the same, the shape was the same, but something had shifted, deepened, completed. It was like watching a child become an adult in a single breath, not physically but spiritually, emotionally, in the way that mattered most. The adult dragon rose. Its wings unfolded, 12 feet for Ember, 100 feet or more for this one, and the seam in the sky opened again, wider this time, and through it Marcus could see not darkness but light, a world of light, mountains and rivers and skies filled with shapes that were winged and vast and alive. Ember looked at Marcus. Its eyes were gold and amber, the same as always. But there was something new in them, something that hadn't been there before. Not just intelligence, not just affection, understanding. The understanding of a creature that now knew what it was, where it came from, and what it owed to a man who had opened a door in a storm. Marcus, Ember said, its voice was deeper now, fuller, the voice of something that was no longer a child in any species' reckoning. I will come back. I know, Marcus said, his voice was steady, his eyes were not. You'll always come back. Ember walked to him, lowered its head, the same gesture the adult dragon had made, but different because this was Ember, his Ember, the creature that had knocked on his door and changed everything. Ember pressed its snout against Marcus's chest, right over his heart, and hummed. The hum was different now, not deeper or louder, but more harmonics, more layers, more of everything it had always been, amplified and expanded and made whole. It resonated through Marcus's body, through the cabin, through the pasture and the trees and the air itself, and for a moment, one impossible, luminous moment, the entire world hummed with it. Then Ember stepped back, spread its wings, looked at him one last time. Bonded, it said. Bonded, Marcus said. Ember flew, not the clumsy, joyful flights of the pasture, not the soaring circles of a creature learning its wings. This was something else. This was a launch, a vertical ascent so powerful it dug furrows in the pasture, a climb that took Ember through the seam in the sky in seconds, a departure that was not an ending but a beginning. The seam closed, the night was dark again, the adult dragon was gone, Ember was gone, and Marcus was alone on his porch, on his land, in the world he had always known. But not alone, not really, because bonded didn't mean together. Bonded meant connected, and connection doesn't break with distance. It doesn't break with time. It doesn't break with the closing of seams in the sky or the silence of an empty pasture or the ache in a man's chest where a dragon's head had rested. Marcus sat on his porch and looked at the stars and felt the ghost of a hum resonating in his bones. And he knew, with the same blood-deep certainty that had guided him from the very first knock on his door, that this was not an ending. This was the part of the story where the human finds out what he's really made of. And Marcus Cole, tired and broken and rebuilt by something small and impossible and warm, looked up at the sky where the seam had been and smiled. The storm was over. But the fire, his fire, the kind that doesn't burn but illuminates, the kind that doesn't destroy but sustains, that was just getting started. In every world, in every reality, in every iteration of the vast and impossible cosmos, there are doors. Most of them stay closed, most of them stay locked. But sometimes, rarely, impossibly, beautifully, someone opens one. Not because they're brave, not because they're special, not because destiny chose them or prophecy marked them or fate decreed them worthy. Because they heard a cry in a storm and they couldn't not answer. That's what humans do. That's what humans are. And if the universe has a problem with that, well, let the universe knock on our door. We'll answer.